So Salman, Bobby Seigel.
Hi.
I don't wish to ask you a question for the sake of asking you a question. I'd just like to make a comment. And that is that all of us here in this house, when we receive a masterful speech of art and prose like we have from you, I hope we can walk away from this house, each one, and on behalf of everyone, with a copy of your speech. I think that in itself is a mastery of literature that we have seen. And secondly, I hope the purpose that we come to the India Today conclave is for all of us to be able to provoke the mind and the thought, and I think you've done a lot in that respect. I hope this speech is not only given to all of us in this August audience, but it gets published by India Today, but also by other magazines and other newspapers in India, for other Indians to read what you've said about our great country. Thank you.
Oh, well, we'll see what we can do.
We'll get you a copy, Bobby, don't worry. Yes.
So Salman, I'd just like you to reflect a little bit more on the relationship between political freedom and artistic freedom. After all, the Bombay that you celebrated was a post-imperial Bombay.
Yeah.
There was a great efflorescence of writing under the Tsar in Russia in the 19th century. You'd mentioned China, but in fact my sense is that artistic achievement in China at the moment is much, much more committed than artistic achievement in India. So how do you see the relationship between the two?
Well, I certainly don't believe that persecution is good for art. You know, there has been remarkable art produced in repressive societies. Or that's to say, if we only think about the famous samizdat literature of the Soviet Union, that was clearly an extraordinary joint effort by many writers and intellectuals to overcome the restraints of that society. Today, we can see that one of the most celebrated cinemas in the world is the cinema of Iran. And clearly, the filmmakers there have found ways to create great art even inside the very restricted confines of the Iran of the Ayatollahs. On the whole, it can also be the case that freedom is bad for art sometimes, because, just to contradict myself, because since the fall of the Soviet Union, it seems as if Russian literature has gone into terminal decline. And not just Russian literature, but the literature of Eastern Europe has been much damaged by no longer having an enemy. And now everybody wants to read John Grisham novels, you know, and, you know, God help us, Dan Brown novels. I think Dan Brown is the single most depressing fact about modern literature. Really. I mean, the idea that book can sell 100 million copies makes one wonder why one bothers. You know? But I think, on the whole, you know, I don't want to over-idealize artists, because artists can be an unpleasant and selfish lot as well. And competitive and envious and backstabbing and in all sorts of ways human. So I don't want to put them up on some kind of pedestal with a halo on, you know. But the truth is that the production of art is something which requires the confidence that you can express the vision that is in you to express without suffering reprisals. And if you do not have that confidence, then what often follows is a kind of self-censorship which enormously diminishes the culture. And you're right, in China today there is a flowering of art, which is greatly encouraged by the kind of regime that is there, or at least enabled. But that's, again, within very strict limits. I mean, if you tried to write a critical political novel in China today, it would not be published. If you tried to create visual artistic statements which were hostile to the regime, they would not be displayed. So, yes, there are brilliant artists in China doing very well, but it's within limits set by the state, and that, in my view, damages the culture in ways that are very difficult to quantify or express. So, I mean, I don't think this is really rocket science. If you want to be able to do good work, you have to feel that there isn't going to be a knock on the door in the middle of the night. It's too often the case in too many countries in the last century that has been the case. I mean, it's true that there was great literature in Tsarist Russia, but as I said, there was also great literature in communist Russia, in spite of communism. Artists have discovered are very, very stubborn people. And one of the characteristics of art, when it is under attack, is to try its very best to survive in spite of that attack. Dostoevsky faced a firing squad and went on to write some of the greatest novels ever written in Russia. Jean Genet spent much of his life in prison and wrote a number of works which are amongst the great masterpieces of prison literature, as indeed did Václav Havel. Some of Havel's prison writing actually is rather mysterious. I had to review one of his books, The Letters to Olga, and there were passages in that book that I simply didn't understand. And many years later, I had the opportunity to meet by then President Havel, and I said, that there were these passages that were completely mysterious to me. And he said, yes. He said, the problem is that in order to communicate with each other in those days, we had to write to each other in very complicated codes. And he said, all these years later now, I've forgotten the code. So even he didn't understand what these passages meant. So, I mean, this is the story of literature has always included a kind of battle against intolerance. But clearly, it's a better thing for that intolerance not to exist.
Yeah, Anissa.
Where?
I just wanted to go on from you're saying that self-censorship's not good and, it's better to write without the knock on the door. But how did you handle all the intolerance and how did it affect your work? Was it an impetus or did it hamper your writing? And were there any novels that have been unpublished or unfinished because of it?
Well, no, there aren't any such novels. I don't know. I discovered that I'm a very obstinate person. And my reaction to people trying to shut me up is to talk louder. And I think the best answer you can give to somebody trying to silence your voice is to try and speak with greater firmness. If somebody's trying to suppress your work, try and write a better book. The best answer of the artist is always in the art. And yes, I've been obliged to become this kind of person who stands at places like this and makes speeches like this. But actually, in my view, the best work I've ever done is the work that I do privately in a room by myself, and then every few years offer it to you to see what you think of it. And my view is, and was then, that the best thing I could possibly do was to go on being the artist I had always tried to be. And I thought there were a number of dangers to me as a writer. One was the danger of cowardice, which could lead to the sort of self-censorship that we've been talking about. The other was the danger of excessive anger, which could lead me to write kind of, revenge books. And I thought both of those would be very destructive to me because they would essentially make me a creature of the attack against me. And I thought really that the thing to do was just to continue as if it had not happened. And to go on try to go on going down the road that I was on, And I guess I discovered I was stubborn enough to do it, I truthfully, I would not, if you had asked me beforehand how I would respond to the kind of attack that was leveled against the Satanic Verses, I wouldn't have bet on myself to have come through it as I have. I would have felt that it would have been very destructive to me just as a person. And it's one of these things about hardship. You don't know how you're going to deal with it until the situation arises. You can't answer these kind of great questions in theory. You can't answer them until they're actually asked. And I think many people put in very difficult situations discover that they have resources that they did not suspect that they had. People dealing with illness or with all kinds of deprivations. People discover amazing resources inside themselves and find a way of getting through. And I think I discovered that I was more resilient than I thought I was. And so here I am, not completely crazy. Well, depending who you ask.
But do you self-censorship yourself in a way? If
No.
you're now writing about Islam in any way?
No, I don't. Do I sound like it? This idea of literature as a vocation, as a calling, I believe very passionately, and it seems to me that my respect for it is too great to wish to abuse it in that way. If I felt unable to write freely and fully, I would prefer to be silent. It seems to me there are enough books in the world. If all of us who are professional writers were to stop writing today, there would still be too many books in the world. And none of us would be able in our lifetimes to read all the great books that there are to read. So if we are going to have the nerve to add to that mountain, then it has to be a truthful work. It has to be something that comes from your deepest vision of the world, and it has to try and express that. And if it doesn't try and do that, it would be save the trees.
Yeah.
So Salman, you said that Britain protected you as a citizen of that country. What would you say should be the role of a nation which is called upon to protect a person who is not a citizen but who's persecuted in her own country, like Taslima Nasreen, against its own citizens who are obviously indulging in absolutely wanton violence against her?
Well, I think you could probably guess that I would wish that she would be protected. I think that I've met her very little, but I have met her a few times. And I know that when she was offered safe haven in Europe, in, I think, Sweden for a while, in France for a while, and elsewhere, she found it very difficult because she was outside her language, and she found it very difficult to function as an individual and as a writer in those places. And so for her, I think it was very, very important to be able to live where people speak Bengali and where she can function both as an individual in the society, speaking the same language as the people around her, and as a writer. So it seems to me like a very small thing to offer asylum to somebody who needs it. And the principle of asylum has been much diluted in recent years. People have found all kinds of reasons to not grant asylum. But it seems to me a big and generous country like this one should be able to find room for Taslima Nasreen. And by the way, I'm much nicer about her than she is about me. I just mentioned that.
The message you gave me was that we live in a culture of political correctness. And quite honestly, what you're saying to each one of us is stop lying and being hypocrites and be free to express what you wish, even though it might be a sacred cow. Am I right?
Well, yeah. You're right. I think that what I'm saying is that we all need to have slightly thicker skins. That's to say, the ease with which people rise affronted by having been offended by this or that, it's just getting to be a little too easy. It seems it's become almost fashionable to be offended. And we just need to sort of deal with things a little bit better, I think. People are always saying things I don't like and writing books I don't like. But, for example, Dan Brown. But I would defend his right to live. Perhaps not to write, but certainly to live. And I just think we need to realize that this is how the world is. People are always going to say things that somebody doesn't like. And if offendedness becomes the criterion for preventing a certain kind of expression, then there will be no expression. There will be nothing in the bookstores. There will be no newspapers. There are plenty of, if politicians stand up and say something that another interest group is offended by, should that politician shut up? If a newspaper says something that some of its readers don't like, should the newspaper stop saying that thing? If offendedness is the line you draw in the sand, then nothing can cross that line, because somebody will always be offended. And therefore, offendedness cannot be the limiting point on thought. We have to accept that strongly expressed, deeply held convictions will offend other people. And that's just tough. It's just tough. Deal with it. And that's what you have to do in any robust, open society. You have to deal with it. You accept that that is the price you pay for your own freedom. Because, to put it very simply, the defense of freedom of speech begins at the point at which somebody says something that you detest. It doesn't end at that point. It begins at that point. Because it is no trick to defend the right to speak of people that you agree with or to whose opinions you are essentially indifferent. It's only when people say things that you actually can't stand that you discover whether you are in favor of freedom of speech or not. Because if you think that that speech should be prohibited, then you are not in favor of freedom of speech, you are a censor. And so the defense of free speech begins exactly at the point at which people offend you. That is the speech that must be defended. Otherwise, there is no such thing as free speech.